Here is a question that seems to be troubling many people. I know it has troubled me personally. Why do some families seem to receive heaping measures of suffering? One serious thing after another with no break, while others seem to go through life unscathed. I wish there were a simple answer to that question. I wish we could say, well, you suffer for this reason or someone else for that reason, and that all of it would make sense. I remember when we lost our son Mark, I read every book I could read to try to come up with some sort of answer as to why this happened to us. Why was my 16-year-old son taken so quickly from us, so dramatically, in just a blinking of an eye? And I read everything that I could possibly read. I read C.S. Lewis, I read Martin Luther, I read every book that I could get my hands on. In fact, one book was called When God Doesn't Make Sense. And the conclusion of that book that Dr. Dobson wrote was, well, there are times when God simply doesn't make sense. And I was dramatically disappointed at the ending of that book because I wanted an answer. And that seems to be what is true in all of us. We want some sort of sense of justice. We want to know that there's a reason why this suffering is happening to me and not to someone else. When Job's friends came around him during the course of his tremendous heartache and physical, emotional, family suffering that he was going through, they too wanted an answer. They wanted to know, why is this happening? There must be something, Job, in you. There must be a reason why this is happening to you. And maybe in their hearts what they were thinking was, well, I want to know what you did to cause this suffering so that I will not do the same thing. Now, we don't know that for sure, but that seems to be reasonable as to what Job's friends might have been saying. Well, the Apostle Paul, probably the greatest Christian who ever lived, suffered enormously. He was beaten, left for dead many times. He was forsaken by his own friends, and his family deserted him. And he comes to this beautiful chapter in Romans chapter 11, where he begins to talk about the depth of God's love. Let me read it to you. He says, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God." In essence, what he's saying is, God's love and mercy for me is so deep I can't even put it into words. But then he says this. He says, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable are his ways. Unfathomable. We can't put our finger on it. We can't figure it out. We can't put an exclamation point behind this sentence that talks about a reason for my suffering. But then he goes on and he says this, for who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. You see what Paul's doing here? He can't put into words the love that he has received from Christ in the midst of his sorrow. Right in the middle of his pain and heartache, he breaks out into a doxology. He can't contain himself. He is so moved by the love of God in the middle of his suffering that he just breaks out into a doxology. But he prefaces all of that with, who can know what God's up to? Who can possibly understand why this suffering is happening to me? Now, I think that question is an eternal question. It's a question that all of us have in this life, but God has promised us something. In the life to come, he will owe us no explanations. Yes, some people suffer more than others. Yes, some families seem to be targeted. They seem to be targeted lightning. It seems to strike them again and again and again, while others who seem even less deserving of God's love walk through life, as the questioner asked, unscathed. It doesn't seem to be fair. Well, that is what life is. It's an unjust world in which we live, broken by sin. But God is putting together pieces of a puzzle, a masterpiece. And he uses our suffering to put those pieces together so that in this life we may not have any answers. We may not be able to pin it down as to why this is happening. But God knows. His love and His justice and His measurements of life for us are all fitting a master plan. He is putting together pieces of a puzzle where when we die and stand before Him, He will owe us no explanation. While it is true that suffering seems to come to some in a way that it doesn't come to others, that can be said of whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian. There are lots of non-Christian people who suffer enormously. Consider the Jews in the Holocaust. Consider the enormity of the pain they went through, while others went through life unscathed. Well, sometimes the difference between how a believer responds to suffering and how a non-believer responds to suffering are pitted one against another so that the glory of God might be seen in how the Christian responds to pain and heartache and brokenness. I wish there were a simple answer. I wish there was a simple reason that we could sit down and say, this is why this is happening to you. But honestly, friend, would it make you feel better if God had an explanation for you? If He were to say to you, this is why this is happening? Don't you really want the pain to be removed, no matter what His reasons? Is it not true that you would prefer that the suffering not be there, and that God just allows you to walk through life unscathed? But to know that behind the scenes, there is not one drop of your blood, there is not one drop of your tears, there is not one drop of your sweat that is going for naught. God is using every single aspect of your suffering to do in you what the Apostle Paul said He was doing in him, putting together this masterpiece, this inscrutable, these unsearchable riches, to know the wisdom and the knowledge of God, and to have it completed one day when you stand before Him and He says, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. Now I will make you ruler over much. And the light bulb will go on. You'll look at the past, you'll look at your suffering, and you'll say, now I know. Now I understand what He was doing and why He was doing it. I hope this helps.